I rewrote this sermon 4 different times. I just want you to know that, because I really struggled with what is the message here, and specifically, what is the good news? Because I got a lot of not good news around this subject, right? It feels impossible. So the first question I started with was, is there such a thing as honest wealth?
Probably not.
And I could not come up with a definitive yes on that one. How can there be such a thing as honest wealth? The self-made man concept, I think our generation has completely eviscerated, right? No one stands on their own 2 feet. Everyone benefits not only from the people around them that open doors and make access, the relationships that they build or their parents build that are completely random and are happenstance of birth, but then the generational consequences of all of those things aggregating in history to build the opportunity for wealth and the opportunity for endemic and generational poverty. So when you start from there and you're looking for good news, it's a bit of a challenge. I think oftentimes what I see in the political context in America is some people understand this and are terrified. Some people understand this and are guilt-ridden. Some people understand this and are angry. And a lot of other people are trying not to understand this. And I see a lot of people trying not to understand this, trying to invest in and believe that there is such a thing as honest wealth, there is such a thing as independence and being self-made and being able to be fully responsible for your whole life. And I see so much conflict in our world really about whether or not we can handle this truth. So I come back to this parable and I think about this manager, right? Now he's dealing with a master who must be very wealthy, because this person can incur debts that are enormous. 100 jugs of olive oil, 100, and these are not bales, these are like huge containers of wheat, right? These are massive, massive debts, which sometimes I think we don't get because we're not using the system that they're using, and we're really distant from the agrarian principles. So like, what is 100 containers of wheat? Is that like 100 boxes of Cheerios? Those are oats anyway.
He's a sharecropper.
This is somebody who has a lot of people who owe him, but the people who owe him are not people in poverty either. Because if you can get a loan of that size, you must be a person of means yourself. So everyone in this parable is a wealthy person. There is no poor person being exploited in this parable. Now there's tons of those people outside of the parable, right? But there are none of the people inside. And I'll just own my own immorality. So I have justified theft on a number of occasions because the person or business I was stealing from I perceived to be wealthy. How many of you have ever shoplifted before? Don't raise your hands. Right? How many of you have ever justified immoral behavior because the person you were doing it to had more than enough and probably wouldn't even notice that the thing was gone? I'll just let you think about it for a second. I have certainly done that on numerous occasions and have felt very justified in doing it, because I didn't have anything and they had more than they needed, and I believed in this kind of Robin Hood economic principle of we should be able to rob the rich and give it to the poor. Of course, there's a lie in that, assuming that I am poor and have ever been in a global sense poor. I will never be poor in a global sense, just because of the way that the world works, but it's all relative. Right? Wherever you're standing, right, the shrewd manager is looking at all this wealth that's moving around and probably skimming off the top and probably feeling okay about it. Right? And then he gets caught. well, what am I gonna do? I gotta do something. I gotta respond in some way. But before I get to that, I just wanna, I went to go meet with a colleague the other day, and the server, I was having a conversation with another server, and they were talking about time travel, and I got really excited, right? And the guy I was waiting to meet wasn't there yet. And so I said to them, if you ever met someone who was traveling back from the future, like 30 years or something, I wanted to ask them like an existential question and walk away and come back in like a half an hour and find out what they had thought. I said, what's the one question you would ask them? If you met somebody from the future, what's the one question you would ask them? And one of the servers immediately was like, what are the lottery numbers? And I was like, do you seriously expect a time traveler to know the lottery numbers? And she's like, fine, who won the World Series? Who won the Super Bowl? And I'm like, oh, you want to make money. That's your primary objective in this thing. And she's like, oh yeah, absolutely. I want to be filthy, stinking rich. Because then I can do good stuff for the world. And then we talked about the Patagonia example. And what I realized inside of that was this assumption that somehow we need wealth in order to do good. Which I thought, God, isn't that us really buying in to capitalism? Right? That we need wealth before we can do good. And only wealthy people can do good. And therefore, wealthy people are good people. Or at least they're people that we need in order to produce God's reign. They're the people that we need in order to fix the world. But of course, the problem with money is that it produces debt. And so what does this guy do when he gets caught, right? He goes out and he forgives these debts, right? Well, you could think that that's like a good thing, except not, right? Why is he doing it? He's trying to put them in debt to him, right? He's just trying to move the debt around. They'll be so grateful that he forgave them. Well, I mean, they're not really going to be that grateful. They're going to believe that they owe him something, right? So at first, he's owed something by this wealthy master. He's in debt. This person owes him something, so I'm just going to skim off the top. I'm justified in that because you're so wealthy. Well, instead of resolving his issues around that, he just moves it and says, well, now you guys will be in debt to me. You guys will owe me, and I'll collect on that later. And this is, I think, what the master commends him for his shrewdness. He says, you know how the game works. You know how the game works. That means I can trust you to be even more part of my system of creating debt and wage slavery because you get how the game works. When I threatened to throw you out, you figured out a way to use the master's tools again. This is where it gets really complicated when we deal with this parable, because it's hard to see what Jesus is actually commending in the parable. It's kind of just like horrible people doing horrible things to each other and then doing more horrible things to each other. It's not even like you're in a terrible situation, how do you make the best choice? Right? It's like, how do you keep using the same logic in a different setting? Is this logic of exploitation transferable? And lo and behold, it is. And this is the challenge that we have now in the 21st century, is will we continue to just move the way that we think into the next setting? Or will we fundamentally change the way that we think? Commentators often say the one thing we can pull out of this scripture is that the manager acted quickly. He pivoted quickly to act. He didn't think, he didn't opine, he didn't self-loathe. He wasn't like, oh God, this is going to be so terrible. He acted. And I don't know, I find that to not be a terribly, helpful thought. And then I started thinking about, well, how often are we waiting for the right way to do something? How often are we thinking about, well, if I'm going to do this, I need to do it in the best possible way, right? What's the one thing that people accuse churches of doing? Studying things to death, right? set up a committee, nonprofits the same way. Let's set up a committee to study this. Let's learn more. Let's get more information. And let's wait until we have the perfect solution to the problem. And that's one direction. And then the other one is to just say, well, we don't have any power anyway. We can't do anything anyway. We gotta wait till we're wealthier. We gotta wait just like this server. Like, once I finally have resources, once I finally have power, then I'll be able to do good. So I either have to do the absolute right, perfect thing, or I have to wait until I have more resources to be able to do something good. And I think that is us really waffling back and forth and not doing anything. And so I think Jesus is coming and trying to offer us a third way. Trying to offer us a third way to live in the world in an unethical system. And the only thing I can find out of this parable, the only thing I can find out of this teaching, the only thing I can find in the midst of empire is that Jesus doesn't call us to fix it or to save the world. Right? How overwhelming is that as a concept? And I want to, Bridget, you brought up something that I think is really important. So this whole emphasis on like recycling, right? And like doing your part for the environment. Do you know what the 4 biggest contributors to climate change are globally? They are the industries that produce concrete, steel, fertilizer, and the raw material that makes plastic. Doesn't that make tons of sense? Concrete, steel, fertilizer, and plastic, are those not the pillars of civilization that we live in right now? Of course they're the biggest producers of climate change. Do we really believe that in our lifetime we're going to stop the industries of concrete, steel, fertilizer, and plastic? How overwhelmed are you feeling right now when I say this? I certainly am. I think, God, we're part of a system that's always going to use these things or something like them, and it's always going to produce an inordinate amount of climate change related consequences. And of course, you know, there's scientists. MIT had a big article about the various ways that these industries are trying to work to change the way that they produce these things so that there will be less of an impact. But at this point, I feel like the ball's already rolling, right? I mean, I'm getting even just depressed telling you this sermon right now. And so I'm thinking like, well, what's the good news? Because we live in this world, and this is what's happening. We live in this world, and the world is going to continue to change and move in these directions. And the existence of massive amounts of wealth and capital is defining the world that we live in. And I think, well, the thing that you said, Bridget, I think is the one big thing, which is, how is there a vision being cast of the world that we want to live in? Because without a vision of the world that we want to live in, we're all going to act in self-serving ways, right? It's only when we have a vision of our place in a world where we are all part of something together that we're willing to, and I don't even like the word sacrifice, but we're willing to kind of pivot what we're doing to benefit this larger good that is all of us together, that I have a place in. And one of the things about wealth is it actually ends up making us think that we're separate, right? I can steal from that store because the outcomes of that store don't affect me, and if they're successful, it's actually exploitive to me. And so fine, I can steal from them because it's a zero-sum game. If they win, I lose. And I think so often our society is structured that way, and we see ourselves that way. And maybe we're never going to change this at some big corporate international company level. But if we don't articulate some way of being part of something together, I think we're always just going to get more and more fractured and more separate and more aggrieved and justified, feeling like everybody owes us something. And so how we have to start that in ourselves and in our own lives, right? Letting go of the world and saving the world. Jesus didn't call us to save the world. Jesus did call us, however, to serve in the world. And the bigger we look, I think sometimes we're going to get really overwhelmed if we don't have a vision of what is the big thing that we actually want, that we're orienting towards. What is the world that we want to live in? Right? The steward had a vision of this world of exploitation, and he just tried to figure out a different way to operate in it. So the only good news I could find, really, is this idea that, I am still engaging in producing debt within other people. How many of you have ever had somebody who, every time you did them a favor, they actually made you feel like you owed them something anyway? There's a person who was talking to me about their relationship with their mother-in-law. And their mother-in-law made it very clear that every time that she provided childcare for their 2 kids, I'll send you a bill. Right? Made a joke about it all the time. And it was really driving this couple crazy. They were really frustrated by the whole thing. So what they decided to do was they decided to take her really seriously and say, it sounds like this is a huge burden to you. We're going to pay for childcare, and then you can see your grandchild on the weekends. Well, what do you think happened?
She tore up the invoice.
She did. And she stopped using that metaphor anymore. And she started realizing that what she was doing was she was perpetuating that same sense of insecurity, that same sense of scarcity, that same sense of you owe me. She was now putting that on her relationship with her grandson. And it was poisoning the relationship in the family. And once the parents realized, there's an alternative to this. I don't have to participate in this debt creation system, this emotional debt creation system. It reformed the relationship. And so maybe, just maybe, little things like that about how we live our real lives can start undoing some of our coupling to this way of thinking, this way of domination and empire. So what's one debt in your life that you can forgive completely freely? Maybe it's a monetary debt, maybe it's a social debt, maybe it's somebody who wronged you, and you still feel like they owe you an apology or something. What's one debt that you can forgive without ultimately, like this unjust steward, creating another debt and forgiving it? What's one risk you can take? What one thing you can offer? One gesture you can make that you can honestly not expect a return on? That's not just an investment in something in the future. What's one risk you can take now in your real life? And I think even deeper than that, what's one narrative in you, one story you're telling yourself over and over and over again, that you've been telling yourself for years, and occasionally you resolve it, and then it comes back, then you resolve it, and then it comes back? What's one narrative that you can just put together a mantra that doesn't invite you to be in conversation with that narrative anymore? Just allows you to put it to bed. Say, I've seen you before, I've had this argument with you in my mind, and I know that I've resolved this, and here I am back again, and it's eating up my time and energy and my creativity. This is robbing me of my freedom. This is one I'm working on personally. How can I just respond to that with a mantra? Say, no, I am worthy. I am beloved. There is a gift I have to give, and I don't need to argue with you anymore. I'm not going to try to earn goodness. I'm not going to try to earn my way into being loved by God anymore. So we can then move on and do the work. We need to act now in our lives. Not to overthrow empire, not to overthrow these systems and structures that dominate and control reality, but so that every action undermines them. Because we will never dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. We have to do it a different way. So how how we get liberated from internalized capitalism. That's the thought I'm going to leave you with today.